So far in the sex trafficking and racketeering trial of Sean Diddy Combs, we have heard testimony from big-name celebrities linked to the now disgraced music mogul. His ex-girlfriend, Cassandra Ventura, better known as the singer Cassie. Cassie's ex, the rapper known as Kid Cudi, who Combs allegedly targeted out of jealousy. There's also been the big names brought up in testimony like Usher, Ne-Yo, and Interscope Records co-founder Jimmy Levine. But some of the names you may not have expected to be entered into courtroom transcripts: 3 US presidents, Obama, Clinton, and Trump. How their names factor into a trial that millions are watching and could put Diddy behind the bars of a federal prison for the rest of his life. We're on the case, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. It's not a shocker that big names have come up in the trial of Sean Diddy Combs. He is an A-list celebrity. He hung out with A-list celebrities throughout his career. But then the name Obama came up in the courtroom, and that was one we didn't expect. Usher and Ne-Yo, that caught a lot of people's attention this week. They were brought up because of actual events that they allegedly attended, where Sean Combs is accused of assaulting his ex-girlfriend, Cassandra Ventura. Former Danity Kane member Don Richard testified that in 2010 in West Hollywood, California, she saw Combs punch Ventura in the stomach at a restaurant. It happened at a dinner that she claims several big celebrities were at. During cross-examination, the defense asked Richard to name the celebs who were there, and she answered, quote, Usher was there, Jimmy Levine was there, Ne-Yo came through. There were a few others too. I don't recall those people, but those are the ones I remember talking to. Usher and Combs go way back. Usher lived with Diddy in New York when he was just a teenager starting his music career. Ne-Yo, a Grammy Award-winning singer in his own right, he has been close to Combs for a long time. He has publicly been in Combs' social circles. Jimmy Levine co-founded Interscope Records. He's a big name, a powerful name in the music industry. Richard didn't say the three of them witnessed the alleged assault that she talked about, but she did say that they were there at that dinner. But Barack Obama, his name came up in a way you might not have expected, and it has to do with Diddy's alleged drug use. Before we get back to the breakdown of what we've heard and seen so far in the Sean Diddy Combs trial, I want to bring you a Law&Crime legal alert. If you received a Depo-Provera birth control shot and you were later diagnosed with a spinal or brainal tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. Morgan & Morgan is investigating claims that patients were not properly warned about this risk. It's free to check, takes just a few minutes, and you don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on your screen, click the link in the description, or go to www.forthepeople.com/LCDEPO to see if you qualify. One of Diddy's former assistants, David James, testified that he used to pick up drugs for Combs and friends of Combs. James said that he once saw Diddy take a pill of ecstasy that had a former president's face on it. The prosecutor asked which president, and James replied, Obama. Drugs have become a key part of the government's case against Sean Diddy Combs. This week, we received dozens of images of the evidence that federal agents took from Diddy's Miami mansion during a raid in March of 2024. Here's a picture of some of the evidence laying on top of a Gucci designer bag. We do have to blur a lot of these pictures because of the rules of YouTube and drug use. So I'll describe for you what you're looking at here. A Ziploc bag with several different kinds of pills. Some of them are pink, some of them are white, some of them are blue, and then there's also a rolled up $100 bill. In another plastic bag, we saw more pills. These are 2 separate kinds. Some are white, some are yellow. Then you have the orange and pink pills that you see here. That is MDMA, according to the Homeland Security Special Agent who testified this week about what they found in Miami. Now, not only did David James say Diddy had a pill of ecstasy shaped like President Obama, he allegedly did a lot of drugs. James said that Combs would take Percocets every day, and then he would also at night continue to take drugs, often switching to X and MDMA. Then there's the small alleged container of cocaine that the government found with a rolled up dollar bill next to it, the cocaine with a label that says DBL Wash. The drugs are important to talk about because Cassie Ventura testified that she would do certain drugs with Combs during those so-called freak-offs, the hour-long sex parties that involved escorts and drugs. Obama wasn't the only presidential name brought up in this trial. Bill Clinton's name was also dropped, but again, not in a way you might expect. It's not that he's being accused of doing anything that Combs is accused of in this trial, even though Diddy does have a history of being an advocate for the Democratic Party and being politically active. But in this case, Clinton's name came up because of a male escort named Sheree Hayes, who testified. He's one of the people allegedly hired to take part in the freak-offs. The name that he goes by in his line of work, by the way, the Punisher. Now, during his testimony, he was asked by the defense if he did drugs during the freak-offs, and he said he did not. He did say that marijuana was often there, and he would be offered marijuana, but he's typically not a marijuana smoker, saying, quote, "I call it a Bill Clinton. I do recall being handed marijuana. I act like I take a puff. I don't inhale." He was referencing Clinton's 1992 remarks about whether he smoked pot, to which the former president said that he did not inhale. The third presidential name that came up in the transcript is Trump. During former assistant David James' testimony, he said that Diddy's favorite hotel in New York was the Trump International. James also said that Diddy would book under the name Frank Black, which is kind of an ode to the notorious B.I.G., who used to go by the name Frank White, by the way. Now, many of the so-called freak-offs were held at hotels, and the Punisher, Sheree Hayes, testified that he took part in a freak-off at the Trump International with Diddy and Cassie. Hayes laid out what he said happened during freak-offs, and these are the freak-offs he was allegedly hired to be part of. He claimed in one instance, kind of a bizarre scenario to picture, but this is what we're taking away from the transcripts and through what he was describing in testimony. Of course, there are no cameras allowed in the courtroom, but Sheree Hayes says that Sean Combs entered the room naked, only wearing what looked like a Muslim hijab, and he was carrying Astroglide. That is the lubricant that has been at the center of a lot of the descriptions of these alleged freak-offs. This week, we also saw key testimony from another major name in the music industry. Scott Mescuddy's his real name, but if you listen to music, if you're a fan, you know him as Kid Cudi. He took the stand and came in kind of a cool demeanor as he entered the courtroom. You can see he's wearing a leather jacket in this photograph of him outside the courthouse in New York. He had a cigarette in his hands before he walked in to sit on the stand, testify about what he said allegedly happened just feet away from Sean Diddy Combs. Now, once on the stand, Kid Cudi talked about Combs allegedly breaking into his house in 2011 when Combs allegedly found out that Kid Cudi was dating Cassie. Then, in January 2012, and this is a key moment, perhaps in this entire trial, Kid Cudi says that his Porsche was lit on fire, and the government presented these pictures to the jury showing them what Kid Cudi's Porsche looked like after the fire. You can see in this picture the large hole in the roof of his car. Now, Combs and Ventura officially broke up in 2018, but by this point, if you've been following this trial, you know how toxic and tumultuous this relationship was. It was on again, off again, officially ending in 2018, but for a period of time, Cassie was talking with Kid Cudi. Cassie testified at the start of the trial that her claims of abuse by Combs went on for years. She detailed about what went on during these so-called freak-offs. These are central to the government's case. Combs' trial is expected to last another month at least. He's charged with racketeering, sex trafficking by force, and transportation to engage in prostitution. He has pleaded not guilty. Joining us now is former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Eastern and Southern District of New York, where this case is being tried, Barrett Berger. Thank you for taking the time to be with us here on Law and Crime. There's been a lot of talk about Sean Combs' drug use over the past couple of days. What stands out to you in that testimony?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually turned into a pretty central part of the prosecution's case. So the allegations that make the drug use particularly relevant are that this is one way that Combs exerted control over both Cassie Ventura and potentially other victims as well. We haven't heard from them yet. But part of the way that he was able to make Cassie compliant during these freak-offs, we learned this from her testimony, is through the use of drugs. So Cassie testified that for many of the freak-offs, she was high. She was given a number of different narcotics. We had other witnesses that came in and testified about seeing her, laying on a bed, appearing to be under the influence of some sort of drugs. So this was what we're seeing now is a pattern of Combs being able to, in some instances, control her through many different ways. But one of the central ways that we've heard testimony about is through these drugs.
How do you feel the government's been able to say that Cassie was more forced to take these drugs, as opposed to she lived as a someone who is in kind of the spotlight? You live that mentality where there's drugs that's always around, showing that she was actually forced to take it, as opposed to something that she just did willingly.
Yeah, and this is what the defense has really made as the centerpiece of their defense, that none of this was forced or coerced behavior. This was all, activity that she did voluntarily, that she wanted access to this lifestyle. She wanted access to his power, to the fame. And so she did these things voluntarily. I think what the prosecutors have to show is that there was not only this huge power dynamic between the two of them, right? He is this, multi-million dollar music magnate, and she is an aspiring singer who really wants to be in that orbit. There's an age dynamic. She was very young when they first started dating, but also this, elements of violence and control. So I don't think that they have to show that every time she took drugs, it was involuntary. As long as they can show that, there were certain instances where she didn't want to, or that Combs was particularly insistent on this, or that this was something that he was really pushing. So they do have to connect this to this pattern of coercion and control, but they don't have to necessarily say that every time she took drugs, it was totally against her will.
And he of course, a larger than life figure, has endless amounts of money. So in some ways, I could see someone saying it's not a surprise that he had just so many drugs in his home, as well as some of the other, baby oil's been talked about at length in this case. But were you surprised by just how much it was talked about that apparently he was regularly using substances, that he himself was someone who partook in these drugs a lot, according to people who were around him?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's surprising for many of us to hear about how pervasive that was, and how much of a factor in their lifestyle this was. But, one thing that's interesting to me is it really goes to this idea of what kind of a network he had around him. He was certainly not able to get all these drugs on his own. He had assistants and guards and people that worked with him that were able to help him procure drugs on a regular basis. This is going to help the prosecutors go to one of, I think, the biggest hurdles that they're going to have to prove here, is the idea that this was an enterprise. Remember, one of the things they've charged is a racketeering conspiracy. In order for this to be racketeering, there has to be an enterprise. It can't just be one person doing this on his own. It's a little tricky when you only have one person sitting there in the defendant's chair, right? He's the only person charged right now. So it's a little hard to show that it's an enterprise. And one way that they're going to have to show that is by, drawing out people that worked for him, what they did to help advance this racketeering enterprise, including helping Combs buy these drugs that were then used both recreationally by Combs, but also to help facilitate these freak-offs.
Yeah, and it's not only just drugs. I mean, there's images that we've seen of like white powder, for example, drugs that you would assume are not legal, but then there's prescription drugs that he was able to get. And typically for folks that aren't music moguls, your doctor is not going to give you that amount of certain drugs. Cassie's testimony, from what we've heard from our reporter in the courtroom, it was incredibly raw. It was incredibly emotional. She's been described by many as the star witness in this case. What do you make of the decision to have her go? And I know she's 8.5 months pregnant, so her availability probably factors into this as well. But for her to go early in this case and kind of set the tone, as opposed to building up your case and then having her come in as somewhat of a grand finale at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was probably a decision that was part strategic and part practical. I mean, when you have a witness that is pregnant, could theoretically give birth any day, you want to make sure that you get them in before they become unavailable. Let's be honest, it also doesn't hurt their case to have a witness that is pregnant. You could tell that the defense was a little bit more cautious with her. I think they treated her with a little bit more respect and probably went a little easier on her because of the fact that she's pregnant. It's not a great look to see defense counsel beating up on somebody who's 8.5 months pregnant. So there probably was some of just the practical, let's get this in before she becomes unavailable side to the decision. But also, when I was a prosecutor, we always you want to start strong and you want to end strong. Anything that's kind of boring, troublesome, you kind of want to bury in the middle of your case. For them, Cassie's a really important witness because she can speak to, this many years of what happened during this racketeering conspiracy. She was there, with Combs and a part of his life throughout, most of the charged time period. And she can speak to a lot of the, various racketeering incidents that have been charged, but she can also give a very good overview of what he was like as a person. She testifies about the abuse. She testifies about the coercion. Through her, they're able to show this video, the CNN video showing his abuse in the hotel room. So I think she was a really important witness. I really can't imagine saving her for the end. It would be hard to kind of paint this picture without her going in the beginning.
Because I think of what she said, and yeah, she was a young girl at the time that they met. She said that she was innocent to a lot of things. She talks about doing these drugs, and then now you're hearing more about the drug use and seeing the evidence related to the drugs that, for example, was found at Diddy's house in Miami. How do you, as a prosecutor, make sure that that really emotional testimony in the beginning still holds, where a couple days later, a couple witnesses later, we're talking about the drugs, and you want to make sure the jurors remember that pregnant woman in the beginning who was so innocent that she was taking these substances?
Yeah, that's always a challenge for prosecutors. And, not only is it hard to keep sort of that emotional high going, but remember, witnesses and evidence don't always come in to a case in chronological order. It's not always a linear description of first, then this happened, then, point A to point Z. You kind of come in bits and pieces. You might have one witness who's only available to testify in a given week, so you have to call them then. So really, that's the prosecutor's job at closing argument. And we're going to see them have a huge job to put all of this together at the end of the case. And what they're going to do is try to bring the jurors back to Cassie's testimony. They'll quote from her testimony. They'll try to draw out and be like, remember when she talked about this? Remember how she sounded? So they'll have to do a good job trying to bring the jurors back to that moment. That is the challenge of having a witness like Cassie go first is, you have a 5, 6, 7 week trial. By the end of it, are the jurors really remembering everything she says? She was such a compelling witness, and I think her testimony was so emotional. You said the word raw. I think that's a good description of it. I think the jurors will remember the effect that it had on them, even if they don't remember all the specifics of her testimony. And that's then going to be the prosecutor's job at closing to bring those back into the narrative.
I think for so many of us on the outside of the world of fame, like you try to think of what it would be like if you were in those circles like Sean Combs, and then you hear about the drug use, the sex, and all of this. And then I think back to this jury, and it's like you have a social worker sitting on that jury. There's like a deli clerk sitting on that jury. What impact could just how exotic this lifestyle was have on people? Like, I think of my parents, if they were sitting on this jury, I mean, they would be blown away just understanding that any of this would be to allege to have happened in this man's life.
Yeah. I mean, look, I was a prosecutor for many, many years, and I read about the allegations in this case, and my jaw kind of drops. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that stuff's happening. And I'm somebody who I think of as having pretty thick skin with this. It's really shocking. It's hard to hear about. I imagine what the defense is really going to harp on throughout the case, but particularly when it comes to closing, is this idea that, the jurors can hate Combs. They can find this lifestyle disgusting. They can find him to be perverted, but that's not what's charged. He's not charged with being a scumbag. He's charged with being a racketeer. He's charged with being a sex trafficker. So they're really going to focus on, put aside everything you've heard about this lifestyle, try to separate that from the criminal elements. It's a hard thing to do. It's a very fine line to walk, right? I mean, jurors are people just like you and I, and it's very hard for somebody to tell us, yes, he's just a domestic abuser, he's just, somebody with this, abhorrent lifestyle, but he didn't commit these certain crimes. That's hard for jurors as it is for anybody to get their head around. So it's a pretty tricky defense, I think, to make successfully, but that's certainly the approach that they're going to take, as they, indicated during opening statements.
Right. I mean, they're saying, look, I mean, you may not like the CNN video, but that's not a smoking gun for what he's accused of in this trial. Related to the drugs, why not charge him with some drug-related offenses, considering he was taking so many of them, and there's evidence that the government has of illegal substances in his house, where I would think for a regular person, if you were found to have, for example, cocaine in your home, which, like, there's white substances that he had, that someone would face a charge, but he's not.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that for, a number of different crimes that you've seen. So for some of the offenses that have been discussed in testimony, right? Even just instances of alleged abuse. I've heard people say, well, why wasn't he just charged with assault? Number one, some of them aren't federal crimes. So here we have federal prosecutors, not state prosecutors. Some of these acts would be time barred, so they didn't come within the time period of the statute of limitations, so prosecutors wouldn't be able to bring them. Some of it may have been strategic, that we really want to keep this case focused on sex trafficking and the nature of, what these victims went through. But I'm not sure why they didn't bring some of these in. My guess is that probably if there was something obvious that they could have charged federally that they would have jurisdiction over and venue over, they probably would have. So, I'm not sure why they made that strategic decision.
And then it's important to remember it's still early on in what's expected to be roughly a 7-week trial, and there's just been a lot to talk about each and every day. But to this point, how would you say the prosecution is doing in laying out that, yeah, Sean Combs, maybe he's a domestic abuser. We're not talking about that. Drugs, we're not talking about that. We're arguing that he was running a criminal enterprise. How has the prosecution done, in your opinion, to this point in making that argument?
Yeah, so early days still, like you said, very hard to know how the entire case is going to shape out. I imagine we'll hear from more victim witnesses. I imagine we'll see more, physical evidence that will connect all these things. But, if I had to say right now, I think the prosecution has done a very good methodical job of showing each of the elements that they need to show legally to prove sex trafficking, the prostitution, and the racketeering. I think they probably are there on the legal elements for each of these offenses. But here's the tricky part. There is still this very difficult, it's I almost want to say, like, the vibe of, a racketeering case that I'm not sure that they've convinced all the jurors that this is a racketeering enterprise. And I think that's going to be challenging for them. I think we need to hear from more people that worked for Combs, that helped assist him with some of these racketeering acts that have been charged. We need to hear more about how this wasn't just, all about him, why this was an enterprise, why it's bigger than just, the relationship between Cassie and Combs. That's, I think, what we need to see more focus on in the next few weeks. Look, they're probably there on all of the elements, and legally they probably have a facially sufficient case that they could even put forth to the jury now. But you have to do more than that. You have to be able to convince jurors that not only is this the legal thing to do, but this is actually, the moral and the right thing to do. And while they've certainly established that Combs is an awful human being, they also need to convince the jurors that these were the right charges, that this wasn't, prosecutorial overreach. And I think that's what they'll probably do and focus on in the next couple of weeks.
And even though it's not a domestic violence case, because that video is so shocking, the evidence that's being submitted showing a lot of illegal substances in his home could still, for a juror, do you find, I mean, how much of an impact does Sean Combs is a bad guy have when it comes to jury deliberations in your experience, where clearly they need to get to a point that he was running a criminal enterprise, but they could look at him through the prism of this is a bad person, and then be able to then make an easier connection than seeing someone that was a saint and then say, well, how could he run a criminal enterprise then?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. In my experience, jurors have these two competing goals. They want to make sure that they are doing the right thing in that, guilty people are held to account. I think they come into this. I really believe in the jury process, and I think most jurors come to this wanting to follow the law and wanting to make sure that if somebody is guilty, that they are, held accountable for their crimes. Similarly, they want to make sure that they don't make a mistake, that somebody who didn't commit it, you never want to be the one that sends an innocent person to jail. Here, I do think the jurors will take some solace in the fact that, however their decision shakes out, if they end up convicting him, this is not a good person. I think, jurors want to make sure that people who have done nasty things, and here there is just no dispute that Combs has done horrible criminal things. You've seen it with your own eyes through these videos. You've heard damning testimony about it from Cassie. So I think they can take a lot of solace of the fact that, whatever they do, if they convict him, it is somebody who very much will have deserved that conviction. So I think that helps. And it just goes to what I was saying earlier, the whole, yes, I'm a domestic abuser, but no, I'm not a racketeer. It might be a good defense legally. You might convince courts of that. It's a lot harder to convince 12 people who've seen evidence of how awful your client was. It's a harder job to convince them.
Yeah, and it's, we're still at the beginning of this. So it just seems like each and every day there's like a new shocking, piece of Combs' life and what he's accused of doing that comes out. We'll see how it plays out over the next 7 weeks. Barrett Berger, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern and Southern Districts of New York. Thank you for taking the time to be with us on Law and Crime. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.